London, early 1980s. A ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and centuries of inherited arrogance. Freddie Mercury stood in the doorway holding a check that could buy the entire building. Within 2 hours, he would tear that check in half in front of everyone. But what happened in between would reveal more about true nobility than any royal bloodline ever could. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier on heavy cream paper with gold embossing. The Great Britain Children's Charity Gala. Black tie. £500 per plate. Guest list restricted to distinguished members of society and their associates. Freddie had been invited not because they wanted him there, but because they wanted his money. His accountant had been clear. Freddie, this is excellent for your public image. The royal family's inner circle organizes this event. You'll be photographed with earls and duchesses. It's exactly the kind of legitimacy. I don't need legitimacy from people whose only achievement was being born, Freddie had interrupted. But he agreed to attend anyway, not for himself. For the children, the charity claimed to help. He'd written a check for £50,000, an extraordinary sum, more than most attendees would donate combined. He folded it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket and called Mary Austin. "Darling, I need you to come with me to something dreadful tomorrow night," he said over the phone. Mary laughed. "How dreadful?" "The kind of dreadful where people measure your worth by how many dead relatives you can name." "Should I wear my tiara?" Mary asked, her voice dry with sarcasm. "Wear whatever makes you feel like yourself," Freddie replied, "because I guarantee everyone else will be wearing costumes." The next evening, Freddie stood before his mirror adjusting a jacket that had cost more than most people earned in a year. Black velvet with subtle embroidery, custom made by one of London's finest tailors. But of course, Freddie being Freddie, he'd added his own touches. A silk scarf at the throat, rings on nearly every finger, a necklace that caught the light with every breath. His stylist had suggested something more conservative. Freddie had ignored him completely. Mary arrived wearing an elegant but understated black dress. She took one look at Freddie and smiled. "You look like you're planning to start a revolution." "I'm planning to write a check and leave," Freddie replied. "The revolution is optional." The ballroom was exactly as Freddie had imagined. Oppressively grand. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from ceilings painted with cherubs and clouds. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge everyone below them. Round tables covered in white linen filled the space, each set with enough silverware to confuse anyone who hadn't grown up with servants. The guests matched their surroundings perfectly. Women in gowns that cost more than cars, dripping with jewelry that had been in families for generations. Men in perfectly tailored dinner jackets, posture rigid with the confidence that comes from never having questioned your place in the world. Freddie and Mary entered through the main doors. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted. Voices lowered. Eyes flickered toward them, then quickly away. A woman in a diamond tiara actually adjusted her position so her back was toward Freddie. A man in military dress uniform raised an eyebrow at his companion and whispered something that made them both smirk. Freddie felt Mary's hand tighten slightly on his arm. "It's fine," he murmured. "I've faced worse than this." "When?" Mary whispered back. "Boarding school. At least these people bathe regularly." They approached the registration table where a woman with severely pulled back hair and a clipboard sat checking names. She looked up at Freddie and her expression went carefully, professionally blank. "Name?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Freddie Mercury." She scanned her list, found his name, and made a small mark. "Welcome, Mr. Mercury. Your table assignment is number 47. She gestured vaguely toward the back of the room near the kitchen doors. Mary glanced at the table numbers. The ones in the center of the room, closest to the stage where speeches would be given, were numbered 1 through 20. Those tables were already filling with people whose names appeared in history books and society pages. Table 47 was in a corner, partially obscured by a pillar, close enough to the kitchen that they'd likely smell food preparation all evening. "I think there's been a mistake," Mary said quietly. "Mr. Mercury is one of your largest donors tonight." The woman's smile never reached her eyes. "I'm sure the table assignments were made with great care. If you'll excuse me, I have other guests to attend to." Freddie touched Mary's arm gently. "It's fine. Let's just sit." They made their way through the room toward their assigned table. Freddie was acutely aware of the glances, the whispers, the way people shifted slightly to avoid making eye contact. A duchess he'd met at a previous charity event looked directly at him, then turned to her companion as if she hadn't seen him at all. At one point, a young earl, probably 30 years old with the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a day in his life, actually wrinkled his nose as Freddie passed, as if Freddie carried some offensive smell rather than the expensive cologne he'd applied hours earlier. Table 47 was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. The tablecloth was slightly stained, one of the chairs wobbled, and they were positioned so close to the kitchen doors that every time a server pushed through, the smell of cooking would waft directly toward them. Mary sat down slowly, her face tight with controlled anger. Freddie took the seat beside her, his movements deliberately casual, as if he didn't notice or care about the insult. But Mary noticed his hands. Under the table, they were trembling slightly. The dinner itself was torture by small degradations. Servers attended to the central tables first, returning multiple times to ensure wine glasses were full and bread baskets replenished. Freddie and Mary's table was served last, and only after they'd explicitly asked. From their corner, they could hear fragments of conversation from the better tables, discussion of hunting trips and country estates, complaints about the difficulty of finding good help, laughter at jokes that seemed to involve looking down on anyone not present. At one point, a woman at a nearby table, loud enough to be heard clearly, commented to her companion about the absolutely dreadful lack of standards these days. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Freddie's corner. Anyone with enough money thinks they can buy their way into places they don't belong. Her companion nodded. Breeding will tell, though. You can dress them up, but you can't change what they fundamentally are. Under the table, Mary felt Freddie's hand grip his knife so tightly his knuckles went white. We can leave, she whispered. Right now. Just stand up and walk out. Freddie slowly released the knife. He turned to Mary, and his eyes carried something she'd seen before. That look he got when someone underestimated him right before he proved them catastrophically wrong. No, he said quietly. I want to stay for the speeches. I want to hear what they say about helping children while they sit at tables that cost more than most families earn in a year. The speeches began after dinner. The charity director, a baron with a voice trained to carry across large rooms, stood at the podium and spoke movingly about disadvantaged children, about the importance of giving them opportunities, about how the generous donations from tonight's attendees would change lives. Freddie listened to every word. His expression remained neutral, but Mary could see the thoughts forming behind his eyes. When the speech ended and applause filled the room, donors were invited to come forward and present their checks publicly. A procession began. Each donor walked to the front, posed for photographs, received public acknowledgement of their generosity and their titles. The Earl and Countess of such and such have donated £10,000. Applause. Lord and Lady whatever have donated £15,000. More applause. Sir somebody important has donated £20,000. Enthusiastic applause. Each announcement included not just the amount, but a recitation of the donors' titles, their family history, their social standing. Finally, the charity director looked at his list and called out, Mr. Frederick Mercury has donated £50,000. The room went quiet. £50,000 was more than the previous 3 donations combined. It was a staggering amount, but the director's voice carried no warmth, no enthusiasm. He said the amount, but included none of the flowery descriptions that had accompanied the titled donors. Just Mr. Frederick Mercury spoken flatly, as if reading from a phone directory. Freddie stood. The room's eyes followed him as he walked from his corner table toward the front. He could feel their assessment, their judgment, the unspoken question, who did this person think he was? He reached the front, and the charity director extended his hand for the check, smiling that professional smile that communicated absolutely nothing. Freddie reached into his jacket and pulled out the check. He looked at it for a long moment. £50,000, made out to the Great Britain Children's Charity. Then, in a movement so casual it seemed almost accidental, he tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the room like a gunshot. The charity director's face went white. "Mr. Mercury, what are you—" "I'm terribly sorry," Freddie said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. "But I seem to have made a mistake." He let the two halves of the check flutter to the floor. "You see, I was under the impression this was a charity event for children, but I appear to have walked into something else entirely." The room remained frozen, every eye locked on Freddie. "I've spent the evening at table 47, he continued conversationally. "Lovely spot, right by the kitchens. Gave me time to observe, to listen, to understand exactly what's happening here." He gestured around the room. "This isn't about children. This is about people wearing the accomplishments of their dead relatives like borrowed clothes. This is about maintaining hierarchies that have nothing to do with worth and everything to do with accidents of birth." A duke in the front row started to stand, his face red. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Freddie said, and his voice carried such command that the duke actually sat back down. "I was born in Zanzibar. My family were refugees. I worked at Heathrow Airport carrying luggage, your luggage probably." He looked directly at the woman who'd earlier commented about breeding. "I've built everything I have from nothing. Every pound I've earned came from talent and work, not from a name I inherited. The rings on my fingers, I bought them. The clothes I'm wearing, I chose them. Every single thing about me is mine because I made it mine." Mary had stood and moved quietly to his side. "But tonight," Freddie continued, "I've watched people who've never worked a day in their lives look down on me because I don't have the right surname. I've been seated in a corner like I'm an embarrassment. I've heard whispers about standards and breeding from people whose only accomplishment is being born." He looked at the charity director. "So no, you won't be getting my £50,000 because I don't believe for 1 second that money would actually help children. I think it would pay for more events like this, more opportunities for people to congratulate themselves on their generosity while looking down on anyone they consider beneath them." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Freddie smiled. "But don't worry, the children will still get the money. I'll just make sure it goes somewhere that judges people by what they do rather than who their grandfather was." He turned to Mary. "Shall we?" They walked toward the exit. 500 people watched them go. Not one person spoke. Not one person moved. At the door, Freddie paused and looked back. "True nobility," he said quietly, "isn't about titles. It's about how you treat people when nobody's watching, how you use your power when you have it, whether you build others up or tear them down." He looked around the room one last time. "Enjoy your evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope the champagne is worth more than your dignity." Then he and Mary walked out into the cool London night. They stood on the street for a moment, both breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping. "That," Mary finally said, "was the most spectacular thing I've ever witnessed." "I probably shouldn't have," Freddie started. "You absolutely should have," Mary interrupted. "Every word was perfect." Freddie flagged a taxi for Mary. "Go home, darling. I need to walk for a bit." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I just need some air." The taxi pulled away and Freddie started walking. He walked for hours through London's streets, still wearing his expensive jacket, still wearing his rings, completely alone with his thoughts. He found himself in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, narrow streets, old buildings, a small pub with a faded sign and steamed windows. He pushed open the door and walked into warmth and noise, a working-class pub, men in worn jackets playing darts, a couple sharing chips at a corner table. No one who recognized him, no one who cared what he was wearing. He sat at the bar and ordered a whiskey. The bartender, an older man with tired eyes, poured it without comment. "Rough night?" the bartender asked eventually. Freddie laughed quietly. "You could say that. Where you coming from dressed like that?" "Somewhere I didn't belong," Freddie replied. The bartender nodded like he understood everything. "Yeah, I know those places." Freddie stayed until closing time, just sitting, thinking, occasionally talking with the bartender about nothing important. When he finally left, the sky was beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. The next morning, Freddie called his accountant. "The £50,000 I set aside for the charity gala," he said. "I want it donated to Great Ormond Street Hospital, for their renovation fund. The whole amount? Every penny. Should we arrange a press conference? This is excellent publicity. No, Freddie interrupted. Anonymous donation. Don't even put my name on it. Freddie, that's 50,000 pounds. If you're not going to get credit, I don't want credit, Freddie said firmly. I want children to have a better hospital, that's all. The check went out that afternoon. On the memo line, Freddie had written simply, "From a friend." Years later, nobody remembered that charity gala. The names of those earls and duchesses faded into the footnotes of history books nobody read. The ballroom where they'd gathered was eventually converted into office space. But Great Ormond Street Hospital's renovation, funded in part by an anonymous donation that arrived without fanfare or publicity, helped thousands of children. Those children never knew the name of their benefactor. They just knew that someone, somewhere, had cared enough to help without needing recognition. Freddie never spoke publicly about that night, but occasionally when friends would invite him to similar society events, he'd smile and decline. I prefer spending time with people who've earned their position rather than inherited it, he'd say. More interesting conversations. Mary Austin, years after Freddie's death, was asked about his relationship with British high society. Freddie understood something those people never could, she said. True nobility has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. It's about integrity, kindness, using your power to help rather than to elevate yourself. She smiled, remembering. That night at the gala, Freddie showed more nobility in 10 minutes than that entire room had shown in their entire lives. He didn't need a title. He was already royalty, just a different kind. The woman asking the question pressed, "But doesn't it seem wasteful? To tear up a check like that? Couldn't he have just donated it anyway and avoided the scene?" Mary's smile faded. "You're missing the point," she said quietly. "That wasn't about the money. That was about refusing to let small-minded people make him feel small. That was about standing up and saying, your judgment means nothing. Your standards are meaningless. Your hierarchy is an illusion maintained by people too afraid to acknowledge that birth doesn't determine worth." She looked directly at the interviewer. Freddie Mercury didn't need those people to validate him. He validated himself, every day, through his work, his kindness, his refusal to bow to anyone who thought they were better than him simply because their last name appeared in some dusty record book. That night, he could have sat quietly in his corner, accepted the insult, given them his money anyway because the charity was supposedly for a good cause. But instead, he chose dignity over compromise. He chose self-respect over social acceptance. And then, and this is the part people always forget, he gave the money anyway, to the same cause, but on his terms, without recognition, without their approval, without needing anyone to pat him on the head and tell him he was good enough to sit at their table. Mary's eyes were bright with old pride. That's what real nobility looks like. Not a title inherited from someone else's achievements, but choices made when nobody's watching, integrity maintained when it costs you something, kindness shown without expectation of reward. Freddie Mercury never sat at their table, but he built his own table. And his table welcomed everyone, regardless of where they came from, who their parents were, or whether they knew which fork to use. His table was built on talent, work, compassion, and treating people with the dignity they deserved as human beings, rather than judging them by their surnames. The night Freddie tore up that check wasn't his most famous moment. It wasn't captured by photographers or written about in major newspapers. Most people never knew it happened. But for those who understand what true character means, that moment mattered more than any stadium performance or chart-topping song. Because that was the moment Freddie Mercury proved that nobility isn't about blood, it's about backbone, and he had more of both than that entire ballroom combined.